The scar on her face was only the visible echo of what the fire had left on her soul. Under Wyoming's relentless snow, Elizabeth gazed with moist eyes at the remains of her dreams, but in winter's silence life whispers. A door that opens. Rough hands that offer more than shelter. Two solitudes that drop by drop, like rain on dry earth, discover together the meaning of home. If this story reminds you that after every storm there is a dawn, give us your heart and tell us, how do you think it will end for these souls marked by loss? The winter of 1879 punished the plains of Wyoming with a fury that seemed determined to erase all human traces. Elizabeth Monroe watched the snowflakes dance beyond the fogged window, while her fingers unconsciously traced the relief of the scar that crossed her left cheek, a mark that drew not only a map on her skin, but also on her memory. The cabin that should have been the beginning of her new life had become a mausoleum of unfulfilled promises. The fireplace fire was slowly dying, as if it wanted to accompany her in her despair. Thomas Miller, the man she was supposed to marry, had been lying underground for weeks, victim of a fever that had taken him before she could learn the exact tone of his voice. Eliza, as her mother called her before the fire took her along with the rest of her family, had left Kansas with barely a suitcase of dreams and the worn portrait of a man she would never come to love. At 22, solitude was no stranger, but she had never felt it as heavy as in that forgotten corner of the world. The creak of wood contracting from the cold startled her. Her gaze drifted to the door, where snowflakes accumulated like a barrier between her and the rest of the world. It was then that she heard the hooves of a horse approaching, breaking the sepulchral silence that surrounded her. Her heart quickened its rhythm, a mixture of fear and hope. Heavy footsteps on the snow preceded the knocks on the door. Elizabeth rose slowly, took the old rifle resting by the fireplace, and with trembling hands drew back the bolt. The icy wind brought with it a man covered in snow, with a frost-covered beard and eyes the color of a stormy sky. James Mitchell, though she didn't yet know his name, entered the cabin like a gust of cold air that, paradoxically, would bring warmth back to her life. Snow formed small puddles around the stranger's worn boots. Elizabeth kept the rifle steady in her hands, although something in that man's gaze told her he didn't represent an immediate threat. The silence between them seemed as dense as the storm raging outside. "I seek shelter until the blizzard passes," he said with a deep voice that seemed to emerge from the depths of the earth. "I had no idea the cabin was occupied." Elizabeth lowered the weapon slightly, studying him with suspicion. "Did you know Thomas Miller?" she asked, noticing how the name echoed in the empty cabin. The man's face changed imperceptibly, a shadow crossing his weathered features. "Tom was my friend," he replied, removing his soaked hat in a sign of respect. "My name is James Mitchell." It was then that Elizabeth told him her story, the words escaping her lips like birds freed from a cage too long closed. She spoke of the letters, the journey from Kansas, the news that awaited her upon arrival. Her fiancé, a man she had never seen in person, had died weeks before her arrival. James listened in silence, his eyes revealing more than his words. When she finished, he approached the dying fireplace and, with expert hands, stoked the fire until the flames illuminated the room with a golden glow. "Thomas saved my life during a flood," James confessed, contemplating the fire as if he could see fragments of his past in it. "I owe him more than my existence." Elizabeth observed how shadows danced across the man's face, outlining the contours of a soul as solitary as her own. It was then that James turned toward her, his eyes reflecting the determination of one who has made an irrevocable decision. "Thomas couldn't be here, but I'm not going to let the future he promised you be swallowed by the snow," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "I promise you, Eliza, I will be the man who offers you a home. If you accept, I will marry you not out of pity, but because honor and respect demand that I not leave you alone in this world." Elizabeth's heart trembled, not from cold but at the unexpected courage of that man. Hardened by life but still vulnerable, she responded firmly, "I accept, James, but you must know I don't want charity. If it's to be companionship and respect, we'll walk together." That night, while the storm howled like a wounded animal, two unknown souls sealed a pact before the fire. It wasn't love that united them, but something perhaps more primitive and honest, the human need not to face the vastness of the world in solitude. Pine Valley emerged among Montana's hills like a town torn from an imprecise dream. The wooden houses arranged along a dusty main street seemed to watch with curiosity the newcomers. Elizabeth, in a pale blue dress she had sewn during the journey, felt the entire town's gazes fixed on her scar like pins in a pincushion. Reverend Ezekiel Harper awaited them in the small white church that crowned the nearest hill. He was a thin man with a grey beard and eyes that had seen too much suffering to preserve illusions, but still maintained a glimmer of kindness. Marriage is not something to be taken lightly, he warned them, studying them as if he could read their intentions, especially in these lands where each day is a struggle. James nodded, his face a mask of determination. We understand, Reverend. It's not a whim that brings us before you. Elizabeth remained silent, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubts and hopes. Was what she was doing madness? Marrying a stranger, a man whose past was as mysterious to her as the future that awaited them. But deep down she knew she had no alternative. Returning to Kansas was not an option. There only the ashes of a life that no longer existed awaited her. The ceremony was brief, the reverend's words lost in the wind that blew through the cracks of the old church. When the moment came, James took her hands in his, rough and warm. Elizabeth was surprised to notice they didn't tremble. James Mitchell, take you, Elizabeth Monroe, as my lawful wife, to honor and respect you, in abundance and in scarcity, until death do us part. His eyes, the color of molten steel, held hers without hesitation. Elizabeth repeated the words, her voice barely a whisper, but firm as the earth beneath her feet. Upon leaving the church, the entire town watched them with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Elizabeth could hear the murmurs, the whispered bets about how long the scarred girl would last in that inhospitable place. James, perceiving her discomfort, placed a hand on her back, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the observers. It wasn't a gesture of possession, but of silent promise. You are not alone. That night, in the modest room they had rented at Mrs. Winter's boarding house, James spread a blanket on the floor next to the bed. You'll sleep comfortably, he said simply, settling on the hard wood. Elizabeth, from the bed, observed his profile silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the window. It wasn't the beginning she had imagined for her married life, but there was a respect in that gesture that she valued more than any promise of passionate love. Thank you, she whispered, and though she didn't know if he could hear her, she felt it was important to say it. The house James had bought on the outskirts of Pine Valley was little more than an expanded cabin, with a rickety porch and a fence that needed urgent repairs. However, for Elizabeth, it represented something she hadn't had in a long time, a place to call home. The first days passed in a silence charged with meaning, as if both were learning a new language, made of gestures and glances instead of words. James rose before dawn and worked until the sun set, repairing the fence, reinforcing the roof, preparing the ground for a garden that Elizabeth had mentioned casually. She, for her part, slowly transformed those bare walls into something resembling a home. With the fabrics she had brought from Kansas, she sewed curtains for the windows and a tablecloth for the pine table that dominated the kitchen. Each night, when James returned exhausted, a hot meal awaited him on the table. They shared dinner in a silence that gradually became more comfortable. Sometimes James would tell her stories about his travels as a cowboy, about the lands he had traversed and the men he had known. Elizabeth listened eagerly, her spirit thirsting for experiences that contrasted with her limited life. One afternoon, while hanging clothes in Montana's cutting wind, Elizabeth observed James working in the stable. His precise movements, his silent constancy, reminded her of her father, a man of few words but of firm actions. The image provoked a pang of nostalgia that surprised her with its intensity. That night, when James entered the house with his face reddened by the cold, Elizabeth offered him something more along with dinner, a scarf knitted with wool she had bought at the town store. To protect you from the cold, she explained, feeling an unexpected blush rise to her cheeks. James took the garment in his calloused hands, as if it were a precious and fragile object. His eyes, habitually reserved, softened for an instant. Thank you. Eliza, he replied, and though they were only 2 words, the tone with which he pronounced them conveyed much more. That night, lying in bed while listening to James's measured breathing from the cot he had installed in the adjacent room, Elizabeth understood that she was beginning to see him not as the stranger she had married out of necessity, but as the man who, day by day, silently built a future for both of them. The idea of opening a sewing shop arose one morning while Elizabeth was mending one of James's shirts. Her fingers, agile and precise, danced over the fabric as if they had a life of their own. It was then that she remembered the praise her mother used to give her for her skill with the needle, a talent she had perfected during the long winters in Kansas. Pine Valley lacked a professional seamstress. The town's women mended their families' clothes as best they could, and single men had to settle for increasingly worn garments until someone took pity on them. When she mentioned the idea to James during dinner, he looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Are you sure?" he asked, setting his fork beside his plate. "The town can be harsh with outsiders." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a determination she hadn't experienced in a long time grow within her. "I need to have something of my own. James, something that comes from my hands and my effort." He didn't respond immediately, but his eyes reflected deep understanding. The next day, he returned from town with information about a small available space on the main street. The space was modest, a rectangular room with a window facing the street and a back room that could serve as storage. The rent was reasonable, but still represented a risk for their limited resources. James insisted they could afford it, though Elizabeth noticed how his gaze avoided hers when discussing the financial details. The Golden Needle opened its doors on a Tuesday in late autumn. Elizabeth had decorated the shop window with some of her best creations: a muslin dress for a girl, a man's shirt with an embroidered front, a wool shawl dyed with natural dyes. The first days, curiosity attracted several women from town, who entered more to examine the newcomer than with intention to buy. Helen Parker, the blacksmith's wife, was the first to entrust her with an order, a dress for her daughter who would turn 15 in spring. While taking measurements, Elizabeth noticed Helen's glances drifting toward her scar. "It was a fire," Elizabeth explained without being asked, her fingers briefly touching the mark. "It reminds me of what I lost, but also that I survived." Helen nodded, her eyes reflecting new respect. "We all carry scars, dear. Some just aren't visible." Those words marked a turning point. Little by little, the women of Pine Valley began to frequent the shop, not only to commission sewing work, but to share conversations and confidences. Elizabeth found herself teaching young women like Sarah Cooper, the sawmill owner's daughter, the secrets of embroidery and pattern cutting. One afternoon, while closing the shop, Elizabeth contemplated her reflection in the window glass. The woman who looked back at her was no longer the same one who had arrived in Wyoming seeking an arranged marriage. In her eyes sparkled a new spark, that of someone who begins to find their place in the world. That night, upon returning home, James greeted her with a carved wooden box. "To store your threads and needles," he explained, his fingers briefly touching hers as he handed her the gift. Elizabeth caressed the polished surface, admiring the wood grain and the simple but elegant design. "It's beautiful, James. Did you make it?" He nodded, averting his gaze as always when he felt exposed. "I have good hands for wood," he murmured. "My father was a carpenter." It was the first time he mentioned his family, and Elizabeth felt the weight of that confidence. That night, while organizing her thread spools in the box, she understood that James had given her something more valuable than a simple object. He had entrusted her with a fragment of his past. As winter settled in Montana, James spent more time on the ranch than on his usual trips as a cowboy. The snow made travel difficult, and although he didn't admit it openly, Elizabeth suspected he didn't want to leave her alone for so long. She watched him from the kitchen window as he worked in the stable, building a shed for the animals or repairing damage that storms caused to the property. There was a contained grace in his movements, the efficiency of one who has learned to survive with the minimum necessary. At night, sitting before the fire, they shared a silence that was no longer uncomfortable. James carved small wooden figures, horses, wolves, eagles that seemed about to take flight. Elizabeth sewed or mended, occasionally lifting her gaze to meet his, which quickly looked away as if he had been caught in an intimate act. They slept in separate rooms, respecting the unspoken boundaries they had established. However, Elizabeth began to wonder if that distance was what she truly desired. Sometimes in the quiet of night, She imagined the warmth of another body next to hers, the comfort of arms that would chase away the nightmares that still visited her. One particularly cold morning, Elizabeth woke to find that James had already left. On the kitchen table, he had left a note written in irregular handwriting. "I'll return before nightfall. Take care in the cold." Those few words accompanied her throughout the day, like a warm presence in the empty house. At dusk, when shadows began to lengthen and unease started to settle in her chest, she heard the familiar sound of a horse's hooves approaching. James entered covered in snow, his face reddened by the cold, carrying a package wrapped in waxed cloth. Without saying a word, he placed it carefully on the table. "Open it," he said simply. Removing his soaked coat, Elizabeth unwrapped the package with trembling fingers, revealing a Singer sewing machine, gleaming and new, with golden inlays on its black structure. "James," she whispered, the words stuck in her throat. "How?" "This must have cost—" "You need it for your work," he interrupted, as if that explained everything. "I've seen you sew until your fingers bleed." Elizabeth approached the machine, caressing the cold metal with reverence. It wasn't just a tool. It was the possibility of expanding her business, of creating more and better garments, of strengthening her independence. "Thank you," she said, and though the words seemed insufficient, the look they exchanged contained everything they couldn't express. That night, while James slept in the adjacent room, Elizabeth remained awake, contemplating the wooden ceiling. She thought about the man she had married, about the small gestures that revealed his character, much more than words. How he respected her space and decisions, how he supported her without conditions or expectations. She realized with a clarity that startled her that she was beginning to feel something for James Mitchell. It wasn't the kind of love that poets describe, overwhelming and passionate, but something more calm and deep, a feeling built on foundations of respect and gratitude that grew slowly like the plants she had planted in the back garden. It was a feeling that scared her as much as it comforted her, because it implied vulnerability, and vulnerability had always preceded pain in her experience. However, as sleep finally enveloped her, she understood that she no longer feared the future as before. For the first time in a long while, she felt she had something to lose, and that, paradoxically, gave her strength to move forward. Spring came to Montana, bringing with it a thaw that transformed the roads into rivers of mud and the fields into expanses of green grass and wildflowers. Pine Valley awakened from its winter lethargy, and with good weather, rumors about the couple living on the outskirts of town flourished like anemones. For Elizabeth, the curious glances and whispers that interrupted at her passing had become part of the daily landscape. Her shop prospered, attracting even clients from nearby populations who had heard of the scarred seamstress's skill. James, for his part, had begun accepting temporary work on neighboring ranches, mainly breaking wild horses, a skill in which few could match him. He returned at nightfall with his body aching but satisfied, and shared with Elizabeth the day's anecdotes while they dined. One afternoon, while Elizabeth was attending to the banker's wife, who had ordered a dress for the spring dance, she heard a conversation not meant for her ears. "Have you seen how he looks at her?" whispered a voice from outside the shop. "As if she were porcelain that could break." "A strange marriage, if you ask me," replied another voice. "They say they've never kissed in public. Maybe the scar repulses him." Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn, but kept her hands steady while adjusting the pins in the fabric. "I'll need you to come for a final fitting next week." "Mrs. Bennet," she said calmly, as if she hadn't heard anything. When alone, she approached the small mirror hanging next to the counter. She observed her reflection, stopping her gaze, say on the scar that descended from her left temple to her cheek. She no longer saw it as something that disfigured her, but as an integral part of her face, a reminder of her survival. Did that mark repulse James? He had never shown the slightest sign of disgust. In fact, sometimes she caught him looking at her with an expression she couldn't interpret, something close to admiration. That night during dinner, Elizabeth sensed an unusual tension in James. He ate in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate as if he were fighting an internal battle. "Today I heard something in town," he finally said, his deep voice breaking the silence. "About us." Elizabeth set her fork on the table, preparing for what was to come. "People talk, James. It's what they do when they have nothing better to occupy their time. They say I forced you to marry me, that I took advantage of your desperate situation. he continued, his eyes finally meeting hers. That I keep you like a prisoner. A laugh escaped Elizabeth's lips, surprising her as much as James. A prisoner? She repeated, gesturing around them. Don't I have my own shop? Don't I come and go as I please? Her expression became serious. James, what we have, what we are, is nobody else's business but ours. He nodded slowly, a shadow of a smile forming at the corner of his lips. You're right, he conceded. It's just that I don't want you to think... I don't think anything that you haven't shown me with your actions, she interrupted, surprising herself with her own boldness. And your actions have always been those of an honorable man. That night, while preparing for sleep, Elizabeth reflected on the conversation. The unspoken words weighed as much as those spoken. What did James really feel for her? Was it just the fulfillment of a promise that kept him by her side? And more importantly, what did she feel for him? Affection and gratitude had evolved towards something deeper, a feeling she didn't dare name for fear of breaking the delicate balance they had built. With these thoughts spinning in her mind, she fell into a restless sleep, populated by confused images and whispering voices that repeated the words heard in town. A strange marriage. If you ask me, the incident with Hank Doyle occurred on a Wednesday in late spring. Elizabeth was closing the shop when she heard shouts coming from the tavern across the street. It wasn't unusual. As night fell, alcohol unleashed tongues and temperaments alike. However, this time the shouts had a different tone, more desperate. She stepped into the street just in time to see Helen Parker, the blacksmith's wife, trying to dodge a burly man blocking her path. Hank Doyle, known for his bad temper when drinking, gripped Helen's arm forcefully while she tried to break free. "Let me go, Hank." "You're drunk," Helen demanded, her voice trembling, betraying her fear. "I just want you to accompany me for a while, woman," he replied, slurring his words. "Your husband is too busy with his forge to pay you attention." Elizabeth felt something ignite within her, a flame she thought extinguished since the fire that marked her face and life. Without thinking twice, she crossed the street and planted herself in front of Doyle. "Let her go right now," she ordered, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. Doyle looked at her with eyes clouded by alcohol, an unpleasant smile forming on his bearded face. Well, Thompson's broken doll," he mocked without releasing Helen. "Shouldn't you be at home sewing pretty?" "Helen comes with me," Elizabeth insisted, ignoring the insult. "She has a pending dress fitting." "At this hour?" Doyle let out a harsh laugh. "Come up with something better, Scarface." The insult hit Elizabeth like a physical slap, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped forward, getting so close to Doyle that she could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath. "I'll tell you one last time. Let her go. Or you'll regret it." Something in her tone, or perhaps in the intensity of her gaze, made Doyle hesitate. For an instant, his eyes reflected confusion, as if he couldn't reconcile the image of the quiet seamstress with the woman challenging him fearlessly. Finally, he released Helen's arm and stepped back, raising his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. "All yours," he spat. "Women like you aren't worth it." As he walked away staggering, Elizabeth put an arm around Helen's trembling shoulders and led her toward the shop. Once inside, she locked the door and lit a lamp. "Thank you," Helen murmured, rubbing her arm where Doyle's fingers had left red marks. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "Don't think about that," Elizabeth interrupted, serving 2 cups of tea she always kept warm for customers. "Do you want me to go get John?" Helen shook her head, a flash of fear crossing her face. "John has a bad temper. If he finds out, he'll go after Hank, and that will only bring more trouble." Elizabeth nodded, understanding. Conflicts between men rarely ended well, and women usually paid the price one way or another. They talked for a while, Helen gradually regaining her composure. When she finally left, Elizabeth accompanied her home, making sure she arrived safely. Upon returning to the shop to collect her things, she found James waiting for her at the door, his face a mask of concern. "They told me you had an altercation with Doyle," he said, examining her as if searching for visible wounds. "I'm fine," she assured him. "I just helped Helen Parker." James looked at her for a long time, something resembling pride shining in his eyes. "You're braver than you think, Eliza," he finally said, offering her his arm to accompany her home. They walked in silence under Montana's starry sky, but it was a comfortable silence, full of unspoken but felt words. Elizabeth realized that for the first time since arriving in Pine Valley, she truly felt part of the place. She was no longer the outsider with the scar, the woman married out of compassion. She was Elizabeth Mitchell, a woman who defended what she believed was right, who had found her voice and her place in the world. That night, as James said goodbye in the hallway that separated their rooms, she dared to do something she had never done before. She stood on tiptoe and placed a soft kiss on his cheek, rough with incipient beard. "Good night, James," she whispered. Retreating quickly to her room without waiting for a response, she didn't see the expression of astonishment on his face, nor how his fingers touched the place where her lips had been, as if he wanted to preserve the sensation. June brought long days and warm nights, where the stars seemed to hang so low they could almost be touched with fingertips. For Elizabeth, the days passed in a comfortable routine. Mornings she tended the shop, afternoons she worked on special orders, and at nightfall she returned home, where James awaited her with dinner prepared on days when she arrived late. However, she had noticed something strange in her husband's behavior. Some afternoons he disappeared without explanation, returning with hands dirty from earth or with scratches he didn't justify. When she asked, he responded with evasions or changed the subject with a skill he had perfected throughout his solitary life. One night, unable to contain her curiosity, she decided to follow him. She waited until James left the house, believing her occupied with a particularly complex wedding dress, and followed him at a prudent distance. To her surprise, he didn't head toward town, but toward a nearby hill, where an old solitary oak stood silhouetted against the evening sky. Hidden behind some bushes, she watched James dig something up at the foot of the tree. The setting sun drew golden glints from the object, which Elizabeth recognized with amazement. It was money. James counted the coins and bills with concentrated gesture, adding more to the hiding place before covering it again. The discovery left her perplexed. Where did James get that money? Why was he hiding it? A bitter suspicion settled in her chest. Could it be possible that he was involved in something illegal? She couldn't reconcile the image of the honorable man she knew with activities outside the law. She returned home before him, trying to act normally when James entered through the door. During dinner, she observed him carefully, looking for some indication that would confirm or deny her suspicions. "Is something wrong, Eliza?" he finally asked, perceiving her scrutiny. "You've barely touched your food," she hesitated. Trust was a fragile bond, difficult to build but easy to break. However, secrets could be equally destructive. "I saw you today, James," she finally confessed, holding his gaze. On the hill under the oak, his face tensed, a mixture of surprise and something resembling shame darkening his features. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice barely audible. "And what is it I think?" she replied, unable to hide the pain in her voice. "I'm not even sure myself." James rose slowly, as if the weight of a long-kept secret burdened him physically. He left the room without saying a word, returning moments later with a worn envelope that he placed on the table. "Open it," he requested, sitting again. With trembling fingers, Elizabeth extracted several payment receipts from the envelope. Upon examining them, she understood they were the rent payments for her shop made punctually each month, payments she believed she was making with her own income. "I don't understand," as she began, confused. "I pay the rent every month. I leave the money with Mr. Wilson, and he returns it to me," James explained, avoiding her gaze. "It was an agreement between us from the beginning." "Why?" The question floated between them like a feather suspended in air. "Because you needed to feel that you were achieving it on your own," he replied simply. "Independence is important to you. I knew it from the moment you told me you didn't want charity." A complex emotion, a mixture of indignation and gratitude, seized Elizabeth. Should she feel offended by the deception or moved by the intention behind it? "I've been saving that money for you," James continued in the face of her silence, "so you can expand the shop when you're ready, or for whatever you decide to do in the future." The last words hung between them, charged with a meaning neither dared articulate, the possibility that she might decide to leave someday, resume her life elsewhere without him. "Why were you hiding it?" she finally asked. "Because it's yours, not mine," he replied, as if it were the most natural explanation in the world. "And because I knew you wouldn't accept it if I offered it directly." Elizabeth contemplated the receipts scattered on the table, the dates marking the months that had passed since she opened the shop. Months in which she had believed she was building her independence, when in reality James had been supporting her silently, allowing her the illusion of self-sufficiency while preparing a future for her. "I don't need you to protect me from reality, James," she finally said, her voice firm but gentle. "I can face difficulties. I know." He nodded, a sad smile curving his lips. "You're the strongest person I know, Eliza, but that doesn't mean you have to carry everything alone." That night, for the first time since her arrival in Montana, Elizabeth understood that loneliness was not only an external condition, but also a choice. James had been there all along, offering her his silent support, respecting her need for independence, but without letting her fall. While she watched him sleep in the cot in the adjacent room, she wondered how much longer they could maintain that distance, that invisible border they had established between them. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to maintain it. Summer advanced, transforming Montana's prairies into a golden ocean that undulated under the breeze. Days stretched lazily, and nights brought with them the song of crickets and the sweet aroma of wildflowers that Elizabeth gathered to decorate the house. Since the revelation about the shop's rent, something had changed between them. It wasn't an abrupt change, but gradual, like the thaw of a river after the long winter. Conversations during dinner became longer and more personal. James began to tell her about his childhood in Colorado, about his carpenter father who taught him to work wood, about his mother who died when he was barely 12 years old. Elizabeth, in turn, shared memories she had kept buried. Afternoons learning to sew beside her mother, the smell of freshly baked bread that permeated the family home in Kansas, the sensation of fire consuming everything she loved. "Sometimes I dream about it," she confessed one night. While they shared a cup of tea on the porch, "I hear the screams, feel the heat, and I wake up believing everything is burning around me." James listened in silence, his face reflecting an empathy that went beyond words. When she finished, he extended his hand slowly, as if he feared frightening her, and covered hers with his. "Memories are like scars," he said, his deep voice mixing with the nocturnal song of insects. "They remind us of what we've survived." That night, when they said goodbye in the hallway between their rooms, James's gaze stopped on her lips for a fleeting instant before wishing her good night. Elizabeth felt a tingling in her stomach, a forgotten sensation she thought she had left behind with her youth in Kansas. The following days passed in a kind of silent dance, where every gesture, every glance acquired new meaning. Hands that touched when passing a plate at the table, shoulders that brushed while contemplating the sunset from the porch. James's scent of leather and earth that Elizabeth began to associate with the feeling of home. One particularly hot afternoon, returning from the shop, Elizabeth found James bathing in the small stream that crossed their property. She stopped, instinctively hiding behind a group of trees, though she knew she should have turned around immediately. The vision of his bare back, marked by scars she had never seen, left her breathless. Water slid down his bronzed skin, outlining muscles forged by years of hard work. There was a raw beauty in him, the beauty of the authentic and unadorned. When James turned, Elizabeth quickly retreated, but a branch cracked under her foot, betraying her presence. Their gazes met across the distance, and for a moment time seemed to stop. There was no shame in James's eyes, only a silent question that she didn't know how to answer. That night dinner passed in a silence charged with tension. Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn every time she raised her gaze from her plate and met James's look upon her. There was something different in that look, something that made her heart beat faster and her breathing become shallow. "I'm sorry about this afternoon," she finally said, gathering courage to break the silence. "I didn't intend to—" "Don't apologize," he interrupted, his voice hoarser than usual. "There's nothing to regret." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for his understanding, but aware that something fundamental had changed between them. Desire, that primary emotion they had carefully kept at bay for months, now floated in the air like the intoxicating aroma of night flowers. That night, while preparing for sleep, Elizabeth looked at herself in the small mirror in her room. She observed her face, the scar she had believed would define her forever, and wondered how James saw her. Not as a mark of disfigurement, she was sure, but as an integral part of who she was. With that certainty in mind, she made a decision. She let her hair, habitually gathered in an austere bun, fall freely over her shoulders. She removed the cotton nightgown and put on a finer one she rarely used. A gift from Helen Parker that she had considered too daring. She breathed deeply, gathering all her courage, and opened her bedroom door. The hallway was in shadows, illuminated barely by the moonlight filtering through a window. The door to James's room was ajar, a rectangle of darkness that seemed to invite and repel her at the same time. She advanced slowly, each step echoing in the nocturnal silence like a heartbeat. Upon reaching the door, she stopped, her hand suspended in air, about to knock. It was then that she heard his voice from within. "Eliza," he said simply, as if he had been waiting for her all night. And like ice that finally yields to the warmth of spring sun, the last barrier between them vanished. Autumn came to Montana, painting the trees red and gold, a final burst of color before winter's inevitable gray. For Elizabeth, the days acquired a new rhythm, a harmony she had never experienced before. Mornings began in James's arms, their bodies intertwined under blankets against the growing cold. Nights ended the same way, discovering together a language made of caresses and whispers. The shop prospered, now attracting clients from neighboring towns who had heard of the Pine Valley seamstress's skill. Elizabeth had hired Sarah Cooper as an apprentice, teaching her the secrets of the trade that her own mother had transmitted to her. The girl's joy at mastering a particularly difficult technique reminded Elizabeth of her own youthful enthusiasm. Before the fire redrew the map of her life, James, for his part, had accepted permanent work at the Henderson Ranch, supervising younger cowboys and handling horsebreaking. He returned at nightfall with his face weathered by sun and wind, but with a satisfaction in his eyes that Elizabeth had learned to recognize and value. It was during a particularly windy afternoon when everything changed again. Elizabeth was alone in the shop, finishing a wedding dress when she heard knocks on the door. Surprised, since she had hung the closed sign due to the approaching storm, she approached cautiously. Upon opening, she found not one of her usual customers, but a boy of no more than 7 years, soaked by the rain that was beginning to fall. He had dark hair stuck to his forehead, and eyes of intense blue that looked at her with a mixture of fear and determination. "Can I help you?" Elizabeth asked, surprised. "My mama is sick," the boy replied, his voice barely audible over the wind's roar. "She needs help." Without hesitating an instant, Elizabeth took her shawl, closed the shop, and followed the little one through Pine Valley's muddy streets. The boy led her to a ramshackle cabin on the town's outskirts, a place Elizabeth had never visited before. Inside, illuminated barely by an oil lamp that flickered weakly, she found a young woman lying on a cot. Her face, alarmingly pale, was beaded with sweat, and her cracked lips murmured incoherent words. "Fever," Elizabeth diagnosed, placing a hand on the woman's burning forehead. "How long has she been like this?" "Since yesterday," the boy replied, his small fingers gripping the worn blanket covering his mother. "I gave her water, but she won't eat." Elizabeth observed the cabin, the scarcity of furniture, the absence of food in the pantry, the peeling walls that barely offered protection against the growing cold. She immediately understood she was facing a desperate situation. "What's your name?" she asked the boy while moistening a cloth and placing it on the woman's forehead. "David," he replied. "And she's my mama, Victoria." "Very well, David," Elizabeth said with a reassuring smile. "I'm going to take care of your mama, but I need you to be brave and help me. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, his eyes reflecting a maturity improper for his age, the maturity that comes from facing too many difficulties too soon. During the following hours, Elizabeth fought against Victoria's fever with the scarce available resources. She sent David to fetch clean snow to cool his mother, prepared broth with the few vegetables she could find, and held the sick woman's head so she could drink fresh water mixed with medicinal herbs she always carried in her bag. When twilight tinted the sky purple, the cabin door burst open. James appeared in the threshold, his silhouette outlined against the evening's dying light. His eyes surveyed the scene, stopping on Elizabeth kneeling beside the cot where Victoria lay. "I looked for you everywhere," he said, his voice betraying the concern he had felt. "Sarah told me you had left with a boy." "This is Victoria," Elizabeth explained, pointing to the sleeping woman. "And he's David, her son. They're alone, James, and she's sick." James approached, evaluating the situation with the pragmatic efficiency that characterized him. Without saying a word, he went out into the storm again. He returned shortly after with dry firewood, food, clean blankets and medicines he had obtained from Dr. Johnson. They worked together through the night, in perfect synchrony that needed no words. James repaired the roof's leaks, lit a decent fire in the fireplace, and prepared an improvised bed for David, who had finally yielded to exhaustion. Elizabeth continued attending to Victoria, whose fever began to subside thanks to the medicines. At dawn, when the first rays of sun filtered through the cabin's cracks, Victoria opened her eyes. She looked around confused until her gaze settled on David, sleeping peacefully under a clean blanket. "My son," she murmured, trying to sit up. "He's fine," Elizabeth assured her, helping her drink some water. "He's been very brave." Victoria then told them her story. Widow of a miner, she had come to Pine Valley following rumors of work in the town's laundry, but upon arrival, she discovered the position was already taken. Without money to continue traveling, she had settled in that abandoned cabin, surviving on occasional work and selling small wood carvings that David made with surprising skill. While listening to her, Elizabeth observed James interacting with the boy, who had awakened and was watching with fascination as the man repaired a broken chair. There was a tenderness in James's gestures, an infinite patience in showing the little one how to properly hold the hammer. That made something tremble in Elizabeth's chest. When Victoria concluded her story, a silence charged with meaning filled the cabin. It was James who broke it, his voice grave but soft. "We need help at the ranch," he said, addressing Victoria, "and my wife could use an assistant in the shop for the simpler tasks." "We don't accept charity," Victoria replied with dignity, despite her weakness. "It's not charity," Elizabeth replied, recognizing in those words the echo of her own response to James so long ago. "It's an opportunity, and we all need one from time to time." Upon returning home that morning, walking hand in hand under a sky that was clearing after the storm, Elizabeth felt that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with James. What they had shared that night was not just passion or companionship, but something deeper, a silent understanding about what kind of people they wanted to be, what kind of life they wanted to build together. "Thank you," she said simply, squeezing his hand. James looked at her, a question in his eyes. "For showing me who you really are," she explained. "For reminding me who I want to be." And though they didn't say it in words, both understood that what had happened with David and Victoria had been a revelation. The family they could form together, the future they could build, not only for themselves but for others who, like themselves once, needed a helping hand in the middle of the storm. The year's first snowfall came early, covering Pine Valley with a white mantle that muffled sounds and softened the landscape's contours. From the shop window, Elizabeth watched the flakes fall lazily, remembering another snowfall a year ago, that had changed the course of her life. Victoria, completely recovered, efficiently organized the thread spools by colors while humming a soft melody. Her presence in the shop had proved to be a blessing. Her eye for color and her skill with embroidery perfectly complemented Elizabeth's strengths. "You seem thoughtful today," Victoria commented. Interrupting her reflections, Elizabeth smiled, turning her gaze from the window. "Exactly 1 year ago I arrived in Wyoming," she explained. 1 year since I lost what I thought would be my future, and found something completely different." Victoria nodded understandingly. In the months that had passed since their encounter, the two women had developed a friendship based on shared experiences and mutual understanding that transcended words. "Life rarely takes us where we plan to go," Victoria reflected. "But sometimes it takes us exactly where we need to be." The door's bell interrupted their conversation. David ran in, his cheeks reddened by the cold and his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Mrs. Elizabeth," he exclaimed, clumsily removing the mittens James had given him. "Look what I made with Mr. James." From his pocket he extracted a small wood carving, an eagle with outstretched wings, each feather detailed with surprising precision for such young hands. "It's beautiful." "David," Elizabeth admired, taking the figure in her hands. "You have a special gift." The boy smiled, revealing the gap of a recently fallen tooth. In the months that had passed, he had gained weight and color, and the shadow of worry that used to cloud his childish gaze had given way to a gleam of curiosity and joy. "Mr. James says we can sell them in the shop," David explained with pride. "He says people from the East pay good money for handmade things." Elizabeth exchanged a complicit glance with Victoria. The idea hadn't been suggested by James, she was sure, but proposed by David himself. James had simply validated his initiative, as he always did, fostering the boy's independence and confidence. "It's an excellent idea," Elizabeth approved. "We can place them next to the counter with a special sign." The afternoon passed quietly, with clients entering and leaving, shaking snow from their boots and commenting on winter preparations. By closing time, darkness had already fallen over Pine Valley, and oil lamps projected a golden glow over the snowy streets. "Do you want us to accompany you home?" Elizabeth offered Victoria, while David carefully wrapped himself in the scarf she had knitted for him. Victoria shook her head, pointing through the window. "That won't be necessary. It seems someone has already taken care of that." Following her gaze, Elizabeth saw James dismounting in front of the shop. The year that had passed had brought subtle changes in him. Some silver strands speckled his temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. But it was the interior transformation that Elizabeth noticed most. The ease with which he now smiled, the facility with which he expressed his thoughts, the openness with which he received affection. David shot out to meet James, who lifted him in the air with a fluid movement that spoke of an established routine. Victoria followed more slowly, after saying goodbye to Elizabeth with an affectionate embrace. When the shop was left in silence, Elizabeth dedicated herself to the final preparations for closing. She was putting away a half-finished dress when she heard the door open again. James entered, shaking snow from his hat. "I thought you had already left with Victoria and David," Elizabeth commented, surprised. "I asked them to go ahead," he explained, approaching. "I wanted to talk to you alone." There was something in his tone, an unusual gravity, that made Elizabeth leave what she was doing and give him her full attention. "Is something wrong?" she asked, a flash of concern crossing her face. James shook his head, a barely suggested smile softening his features. From his jacket, he extracted a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with simple string. "Happy anniversary," he said, extending it to her. Elizabeth looked at him confused. "But our wedding anniversary isn't until—" "I'm not referring to that anniversary," he interrupted gently. "Today marks 1 year since I found you in that cabin in Wyoming. Since we found each other, actually." Emotion formed a knot in Elizabeth's throat. She took the package with trembling hands and carefully undid the wrapping. Inside she found a wooden box, exquisitely carved with floral motifs. Upon opening it, a soft melody began to play. The same song her mother used to hum to her before sleep, and that Elizabeth, without realizing, had hummed on countless occasions while sewing. "James," she whispered, words escaping her. "How?" "The melody wasn't hard to remember," he explained, his gaze fixed on her. "The carpentry took me longer. I wanted it to be perfect." Elizabeth caressed the box's polished surface, her fingers tracing the outlines of the carved flowers, recognizing the same ones that grew in the back garden of her home in Kansas. "It is," she affirmed, lifting her gaze to him. "It's perfect." James stepped forward, taking her hands in his. His face reflected a determination that Elizabeth recognized, the same she had seen that night by the fireplace, when he offered her a future neither could imagine then. "Eliza, I'm not here because of a promise," he said, his deep voice resonating in the shop's silence. "I'm here because I love you. My heart is already yours." The tears Elizabeth had contained finally overflowed, tracing wet paths down her cheeks. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a relief so deep it bordered on pain, the relief of finally hearing the words she had desired without daring to hope for. "And I was already hoping to hear that," she replied, the words from her mouth an echo of those that had resonated in her heart for months. "I love you, James." They kissed then, not as they had done so many times in the intimacy of their home, but as if it were the first time rediscovering each other under a new light. When they separated, James rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mixing in the cold air. "Let's go home," he murmured. And in those 3 simple words was contained an entire shared life, an entire future to build. Spring returned to Montana, bringing with it an exuberant greenness that transformed the prairies into an undulating sea. At the Mitchell Ranch, as it was now known in Pine Valley, life flourished with the same intensity as the surrounding nature. Elizabeth contemplated the sunset from the expanded porch, her hands busy with an intricate embroidery destined for Sarah Cooper's trousseau, who would marry the banker's son in autumn. The sound of children's laughter came from the garden, where David helped James plant the flax seeds that Elizabeth had insisted on cultivating. The soil is good for livestock, but it can also be good for other things, she had explained to James months earlier, showing him the specially ordered seeds. My father cultivated flax in Kansas. The fiber is perfect for fine fabrics. James, who had initially shown skepticism, had yielded to her enthusiasm. Now, while she watched him patiently teach David how to prepare the furrows, Elizabeth felt a wave of gratitude for the life they had built together, a life neither had imagined when they met in that storm-battered cabin. The shop prospered under Elizabeth and Victoria's joint direction. David's carvings, increasingly sophisticated, sold quickly to travelers passing through Pine Valley. James had expanded his responsibilities at the Henderson Ranch and now supervised horse breeding, a task that combined his skills as a trainer with a natural instinct for recognizing the best bloodlines. But beyond material achievements, it was the interior transformation that Elizabeth valued most. The frightened girl who had arrived in Wyoming, with a scar on her face and heart closed by fear, had given way to a woman who recognized herself not by her losses, but by what she had built from the ashes. James, for his part, had found in her not only a companion, but a mirror that reflected back an image of himself he had never contemplated, that of a man capable not only of surviving in solitude, but of flourishing in company, of building something lasting and meaningful. The sun descended slowly, tinting the distant mountains a golden pink. Elizabeth left her embroidery and approached the garden, where James and David had finished their task and now contemplated their perfectly aligned furrows with satisfaction. "It'll be a good crop," James affirmed, wrapping his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders when she joined them. "If the weather cooperates." "It will cooperate," she replied with a confidence that wasn't arrogance, but the certainty of one who has learned that life, even in its darkest moments, always finds a way toward light. David, who had grown several inches in the last year, pointed toward the horizon. "Look," he exclaimed. "Victoria comes with Dr. Johnson." Indeed, two figures on horseback were approaching along the road leading to the ranch. Victoria and Dr. Johnson had met during her illness, and since then the widowed doctor had found numerous excuses to visit the sewing shop. "They'll dine with us," Elizabeth remembered. "I promised Victoria I'd teach her to prepare the stew that David likes so much." The four headed toward the house, now expanded with an additional room that James had built for David. Although the boy still officially lived with his mother, he spent so much time at the ranch that he practically formed part of the family. Dinner passed among animated conversations and sincere laughter. Dr. Johnson, a reserved man who had lost his wife during an epidemic years earlier, seemed revitalized in Victoria's presence. David entertained everyone with stories from town, imitating with surprising precision Reverend Harper's gestures or Mr. Wilson's peculiar accent. When the boy finally fell asleep on the sofa, exhausted by the day of work and emotions, Dr. Johnson cleared his throat nervously. "I have an announcement to make," he declared, taking Victoria's hand on the table. "I've asked Victoria to be my wife, and she, thank God, has accepted." The news, though not entirely unexpected, filled the room with warm joy. Elizabeth hugged Victoria, recognizing in her friend's eyes the same gleam she herself had discovered in her own reflection, that of a woman who, after the storm, finds not only shelter but a new dawn. Later, when the guests had left and the house was quiet, James and Elizabeth remained on the porch, contemplating Montana's starry sky. He embraced her from behind, his chin gently resting on her head, their bodies fitting perfectly like pieces of a finally solved puzzle. "Are you happy, Eliza?" James asked, his voice barely a murmur in the night stillness. She turned in his arms to look at him directly, her hand caressing his cheek rough with incipient beard. "More than I thought possible," she replied honestly. "And you?" "I never thought I deserved this," he confessed, his eyes reflecting the stars. "A family, a real home, someone who would wait for me at the end of the day." "You deserve everything, James Mitchell," she affirmed, kissing him softly. And more. That night, while the moon rose over Montana's mountains, two souls who had found each other in the middle of the storm rested intertwined, not as two separate beings seeking solace in proximity, but as an indivisible unity forged in adversity's fire and tempered by true love. Autumn had come again to Pine Valley, painting the trees in reddish and golden tones that the wind gradually stripped away, creating whirlwinds of dry leaves that danced through the streets like restless spirits. On the second anniversary of her arrival in Wyoming, Elizabeth decided to return to the place where it all began. James accompanied her without asking questions. They had learned to communicate in a language that transcended words, made of glances, gestures, and understanding silences. They rode for days, crossing prairies and forests whose appearance changed with the season's advance, as if nature itself prepared for a prolonged sleep. The cabin was still there, more deteriorated by abandonment, but recognizable. Elizabeth dismounted slowly, feeling the weight of memories descend upon her like a familiar blanket. Images succeeded in her mind. Snow accumulating in the threshold, the dying fire in the fireplace, a stranger's silhouette outlined against the storm. "It seems smaller than I remembered," she commented, while James tied the horses. "It is," he confirmed, observing the structure with critical eyes. "Or maybe we're bigger now." They entered together, their steps raising dust clouds that danced in the sun rays, filtering through the roof's cracks. The fireplace was cold and empty, but Elizabeth could feel the echo of the warmth that had once united them in a desperate and brave promise. "Here is where we began," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as if she feared disturbing the ghosts of the past. "Where you offered me a future neither of us could imagine." James nodded, his eyes surveying the space as if he too were reliving those moments. "I was afraid," he confessed, taking her hand. "Not of the promise, but of not being worthy of it." Elizabeth squeezed his fingers, understanding. Both had arrived at that encounter, carrying the weight of their own scars, visible and invisible. Both had feared that those wounds would incapacitate them from building something new and beautiful on the foundations of pain. They left the cabin when the sun began to decline, tinting the sky orange and purple. James extracted a small package from his saddlebag, wrapped in a piece of cloth that Elizabeth recognized. It was part of the blue dress she had worn on her wedding day. "I wanted to give you this here," he explained, handing it to her. Where everything began. With trembling fingers, Elizabeth unwrapped the gift. It was a fine linen handkerchief, embroidered with the initial M in one corner, an object Elizabeth had seen before but never in James's hands. It was Thomas's, she understood, caressing the soft fabric. "Have you had it all this time?" James nodded, his gaze lost on the horizon where the sun gradually disappeared. "I found it among his things when, after he died," he explained. "I thought of returning it to his family, but he had no one." "Like us, then." Elizabeth contemplated the handkerchief, feeling its symbolic weight. It wasn't just a piece of cloth, but a testimony to the invisible connections that interweave human destinies, of how one person's loss can mysteriously become the beginning of something new for others. "Why now?" she asked, lifting her gaze to James. "Because I no longer need it to remember my promise," he replied simply. "Because what began as a duty has become the center of my life. Because I love you, Eliza, not for what I promised a dead man, but for what I discover in you each day." Tears came to Elizabeth's eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude so deep it hurt. Without words, she untied the cord that held her hair, letting the autumn breeze stir it freely. Then, with deliberate movements, she tied Thomas's handkerchief around a low branch of the nearest tree. "So it can find its way home," she explained to James's questioning look. "So he knows you fulfilled your promise and more." They walked away from the cabin when the first stars began to appear in the darkened sky. They didn't look back, but Elizabeth could feel the handkerchief waving in the night breeze, like a flag of truce between past and present, between what they had lost and what they had found. They camped under a sky studded with stars so bright they seemed within reach. Sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket she shared with James, Elizabeth contemplated the firmament's immensity with a sensation of peace she had never before experienced. "My mother used to say that stars are holes in heaven's floor," she commented, resting her head on James's shoulder. "That through them filters the light from a place where pain doesn't exist." James remained silent a moment, as if weighing his words. "Maybe she was right," he finally said. "Or maybe stars are reminders that, even in the deepest darkness, there are always points of light that guide us." Elizabeth smiled, recognizing in that reflection the essence of the man with whom she had chosen to share her life, pragmatic but capable of glimpsing beauty in the ordinary. anchored to earth but with his gaze set on the horizon. That night, under Wyoming's starry mantle, Elizabeth understood that the scars both bore, the visible ones on her face, the invisible ones in their hearts, were not marks of what they had lost but maps of what they had survived. They didn't define their limits, but traced the path that had led them to each other. And while the fire slowly consumed itself, becoming embers that radiated constant and lasting warmth, Elizabeth intertwined her fingers with James's, feeling in that simple gesture the fulfilled promise of a home not as a physical place, but as a state of the soul, the place where two solitary paths meet and decide, against all odds, to continue together under the infinite language of stars.